I saw Longlegs recently and I thought I'd give some of my thoughts on it, but before we get into it, I think it's appropriate to disclaim that my analysis may feature some uncomfortable discussions of abuse and trauma, particularly involving minors as it relates to the film. So I'm going to set up a timer, and anyone who wants to click away, who just stumbled across this, now's your chance. So, if you're still here, let's begin. Longlegs is a crime/horror thriller movie that was released this year being 2024. It was written and directed by Osgood Perkins and was distributed by Neon. It stars Micah Monroe as FBI Special Agent Lee Harker, Blair Underwood as Lee Superior Officer Agent Carter, and Nicolas Cage as the titular serial killer known as Longlegs. And don't worry, Nicolas Cage as Longlegs is not some reveal. It's actually laid out pretty early in the opening credits. It literally says Nicolas Cage as Longlegs, so there's nothing immediately getting spoiled there. The movie itself is more about the chase and the FBI's struggle to identify and capture the serial killer. In that sense, it's more akin to the string of movies based on Thomas Harris's novels, such as Silence of the Lambs or Red Dragon, where we alternate between the point of view of the killer and law enforcement. And I guess as a second disclaimer, I don't know your particular sensitivities to spoilers. I personally don't understand fully how media can be spoiled for people. Art is meant to be experienced, and even from a very mechanical perspective, most stories are not original nor unique. Every single one has some underlying, identifiable structure that we can recognize from other works that have preceded it. If you've seen my other content, I'm far more concerned about how and why the events of a film happen, and how they relate to the real world. I guess that sort of inoculates me from the sense of loss that some people feel from having a movie spoiled. So, I'll give a spoiler alert, but to all the people out there whose days get ruined by hearing about the ending of a movie, book, or whatever form of media you choose to consume storytelling through, the conclusion of a story is not the entirety of it. I know that sounds pretentious, but simply knowing how something ends is not a substitute for experiencing it. Having twists and endings that either meet or upend the audience's expectations are not a sign of well-made art. All these are aspects and devices that exist in a much larger construction that we can see as either being executed well or poorly. This is true across all art forms. The instruments for which we choose to express art are important, sure, but they're never as important as the creativity shown by the artist using them. What I mean to say is, I hope that if you're a person who is averse to spoilers, I would invite you to examine that a little deeper as to whether or not it is as important as you think it is. But, spoilers ahead, I guess. I will start by noting that this movie takes place somewhere between 1993 and 2001. It's never made quite clear, but because of the portrait of then President Bill Clinton hanging in the offices of the FBI, we can then approximate the timeline. Also, because of the paperwork and license plates, we also know that this takes place in the state of Oregon. Whether these details are incidental or meaningful is not easy for me to answer. However, I will save what little theories I have regarding that for later in this video. From the beginning of the film, we are let in on the fact that there have been a series of murders spanning decades. While they all bear some similarities in terms of targeting, that is, the victims are usually a family with a young child whose birthday falls on particular dates in the calendar year. The only direct link that strings them all together is the fact that, at each scene of the murders, there's a cipher that is always signed Longlegs. This particular detail seems to be inspired by the real-life ciphers left by the Zodiac Killer. Much like the ciphers left by the Zodiac, the ciphers left by Longlegs have not been decoded. And before someone can call me on it, I know. There is one confirmed decryption of one of the Zodiac ciphers. To make matters worse, Longlegs does not even appear to ever have been at the crime scenes, and the actual perpetrator, at least from a forensic standpoint, is always someone within the household. Though it is hinted that the surviving family member who perpetrated the murders is later killed by someone else. We're also let in on the fact that Agent Harker may be psychic. This is discovered whenever she is canvassing a neighborhood for a suspect in a separate case and is able to correctly pinpoint which house he is occupying in a suburban hellscape of cookie-cutter homes. And I will say there is actually a pretty fun misdirect early in these opening scenes. Through visual framing, there appears to be a budding relationship between Harker and her partner who just recently has been assigned to her, It's hard to know if it's possible romance or not, but Osgood Perkins does a very good job in such a short amount of time into making us believe that Agent Fisk, played by Dakota Dolby, will play a much larger role in this film than he does. However, little do we know, Agent Fisk is not long for this world, and is immediately gunned down after knocking on the door of the home that Harker says they should investigate. The unceremonious and sudden demise of Agent Fisk is the first in a series of events within the film that, depending on how you view it, can be seen as either the consequences of a cold, uncaring universe or the work of an invisible hand callously manipulating our material world for its own ends. While there are, to some degree, supernatural elements within the film, not everything within the film is supernatural, and at times there is almost a willful intent on the part of Osgood Perkins to balance out what can be attributed to what is supernatural and what isn't. I don't find this to be careless or ambiguous on the part of the writer/director, but rather a manifestation of Perkins' own possible agnosticism. Now, this isn't me making claims about Osgood Perkins and his religious beliefs. I don't know him. I'm just going off what information I have interpreted from the only two films of his that I've seen. This one, and the other being The Black Coat's Daughter. Anyway, after Agent Fisk is gunned down, Lee Harker is able to successfully capture the suspect, who offers no resistance. The possible psychic ability Harker displays in tracking down the suspect is further tested in a small scene where she is forced to view a slideshow of abstract images and associates words with them. In addition to this, she is prompted by the disembodied voice that is conducting her evaluation to guess a number within a specified range. The scene actually reminded me of the debriefing procedure that Kay goes through in Blade Runner 2049, in terms of pacing and how random and opaque the entire process seems from the outside. I don't know if that was intentional or not, or if the scene is actually rooted in some actual after-action law enforcement procedure. I've never worked in law enforcement. I don't know anyone who has worked in law enforcement. Though, when I was younger and did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I did attend a class that had a few cops, one of which I did get the choke out, and that was extremely satisfying. After the evaluation, we learned that Agent Harker was able to successfully guess half of the answers correctly. This causes her superior officer, Agent Carter, to refer to her as a half-psychic, which to me is yet another example of how the film tries to dissuade the audience from any certainty in their beliefs in either direction about the existence of the supernatural. Once Harker officially becomes part of the Longlegs investigation, she spends hours trying to decode the ciphers. We get all the tropes associated with these detective stories, corkboards and all. As one of the days comes to a close, Agent Carter makes note of Harker's dogged determination to solve the case, before suggesting that they get a drink together. And no, not in that way. It's purely collegial. Harker notes that she doesn't drink alcohol, to which Carter replies, "Fine, you watch me drink and we will talk about the case," or something like that. It's actually quite disarming. Well, at least it is to me. I mean, I'm not a woman. I can't speak to the experience of what it feels like when a man who has power over you asks you to have a drink with them. But from the female friends I have, I know there's always a lingering sense of dread when interacting with men they don't know. Anyhow, I can't quite remember what happens when they go for drinks. Not that it matters, though. The entire scene is just a means to set up an excuse so that Lee Harker has to drive Agent Carter home, which, it's responsible. Don't let people drink and drive. It's just not the best choice in life, though I have my own personal gripes in that regard, especially when it comes to how severely underfunded public transportation is in the majority of the United States. I'm just saying, if you don't want people to drink and drive, a surefire way is to just build a robust public transportation system and redesigning cities so that they aren't so dependent on cars. But that's just me. When we arrive at Agent Carter's house, we're shown he has a family, a wife and a young daughter. We find out that his daughter Ruby, played by Ava Kelders, is having a birthday soon, and obviously with the Longlegs killings also being known within the film as the birthday murders, this immediately raises alarms. At Ruby's request, Agent Harker and her spend time alone in Ruby's bedroom. It feels a little strange and kind of forced, but perhaps Osgood Perkins felt he had no other way to naturally introduce the following elements to the film. Firstly, Lee Harker notices that one of the many trophies Ruby has is missing its head. It's an unusual detail that immediately grabs Harker's attention. When asked why, Ruby states she doesn't know how it happened. In addition, it's noted that Ruby has a smaller bed in her room from when she was much younger. She knows that her parents don't wish to part with it, and it feels odd, certainly, but It seems to be rationalized away as Ruby's parents' inability to throw away her childhood things in some vain effort to stop the arrow of time and its inevitable, unending march forward. Ruby makes a comment to this effect before inviting Agent Harker to her birthday party, which Lee then accepts. At some point, we are treated to another crime scene, another batch of victims for the birthday murders with a bit of gore and shock. The movie doesn't lean too heavily on graphic violence. Most of the crime scenes we experience are from evidence photographs and at least one flashback, and a lot of it does happen off screen. But for the most part, the movie is not particularly violent, though my gauge for that might be a little distorted. I would say compared to something like 120 Days of Salo, Funny Games, and Irreversible, that it's not that violent. Though I've also been a Shudder subscriber for nearly 9 years now, and maybe I'm just a little desensitized. After we meet the Carters, we learn that Agent Harker lives alone in a desolate area, in a home that I can really only describe as cabin chic. It's hard for me to nail down, but I've been in a few cabins, and Lee Harker's home has a very modern and abstract design to it. It's just worth noting. Just given how plain and impersonal the rest of the world appears in this movie, we have the cookie cutter suburbs and the cold brutalism of government and health facilities throughout. In this film, we have this theme about coerced existence. I'll expand a little bit more on that later, but it's more important to know that almost no one in this movie seems to exhibit free will. So the fact that Harker's living space seems to have any personality at all is rather striking. While home, Harker decides to call her mother, and Lee begins the phone call by asking what had taken her mother so long to answer the phone. It isn't particularly an accusation, rather, the analytical drive that Agent Harker seems to possess is incapable of ever truly being turned off, and she seems to approach this with some genuine curiosity. The conversation between Lee and her mother isn't quite an exposition dump, but we do learn a few things. For instance, we learn that Lee's birthday is coming up soon. We also get a sense that Lee's mother seems a bit too interested in Lee's work, and she even asks about the case that she's currently working on, offering up that she's not squeamish because she had worked as a nurse for 8 years. This seems like a throwaway in the moment, but we'll learn later that this is probably more consequential. Before their conversation is interrupted, Lee's mother, Ruth, asks if Harker has been saying her prayers, to which Lee seems to respond untruthfully by saying she has. The conversation is interrupted by a knocking at the door, and given the remoteness of Harker's home and the lateness of the hour, it's immediately suspicious. Agent Harker cautiously approaches the door and asks who it is, but receives no response. When she returns to her office, she sees Longlegs in the forest outside of her window and, with gun in hand, attempts to track him down. However, she's unable, and we see that while she is outside, Longlegs has already made it into her home. He places a birthday card on Lee Harker's desk that is written in the same code as the other ciphers located at the previous crime scenes. Struck by either clairvoyance or intuition, Agent Harker realizes that she can use the Holy Bible to decode the cipher on her desk. In doing so, she realizes that particular cipher is a threat to keep her methodology secret, or Longlegs will harm her mother. Lee Harker presents her translations to Agent Carter, and notes that the ciphers seem to extensively reference a family by the surname of Camera. This rings a bell to Agent Carter, who notes that the case had not previously been tied to the birthday murders. The Camera family's slayings happened decades prior, in 1971, and unlike the other known murders, there was one known survivor. The family's youngest child, Carrie Ann Camera, had been at school during the murders, and upon discovering her murdered family, was rendered catatonic and has since been housed in a mental health facility. And I would like to take a quick aside to note that Agent Carter is a bit too trusting of Lee's translations. Scientific rigor demands that any and all results can be both predictable and repeatable. Lee Harker's refusal to submit her methodology does leave the door open to the veracity of her results. I believe it to be unintentional on the part of Osgood Perkins. However, it did remind me how often junk science is adopted by law enforcement. With the new clues, Agents Carter and Harker embark on a trip to the Camera family ranch, which remains abandoned, even after almost 2 decades. In a barn located on the ranch, the agents discover a life-size doll sealed in the floorboards. The doll is immediately taken to a coroner for scientific analysis. We learn the doll has human hair, and within its head there is a hollow metal ball that the coroner has dubbed the brain. The brain, as he calls it, is itself quite unremarkable. However, when the coroner uses a sonograph on it, it does emit a hum that he just can't explain. The coroner even notes that when he had first discovered this, that he could have sworn it was saying his ex-wife's name, but dismisses it as a sign of fatigue. After some time, they learn that the surviving member of the Camera family, Slangs, has now become lucid, coincidentally when the brain in the doll was opened up for examination. Upon learning this, the agents go to the mental health facility, which Carrie Ann Camera has been staying for nearly 2 decades. When the agents arrive, they are greeted by a clinician who notes that Lee Harker appears to have already visited Carrie sometime earlier. While he wasn't there to witness it, he does note that this is how the visitor log is signed, though he does mention that the hospital's policy on visitors is rather lax, and they do nothing to vet whether or not a person is who they say they are. I don't know how realistic this is, especially for the 90s. It seems both far-fetched and extremely plausible at the same time. Having grown up in the 90s, it is kind of fair to say that the world was a little less concerned with the identification of people than it is now. A lot of things were done almost entirely on the honor system. However, I'm almost 100% certain one cannot just visit a mental health hospital and select the patient with whom to spend time with alone. There was probably a better way to write this, but whatever. Osgood Perkins gets his movies made and I don't, so. In any case, we meet Carrie Ann Camera, who is played by Kiernan Shipka. And though she is no longer catatonic, she is no more helpful to the FBI. She often speaks in very obtuse ways, but notes that Lee does look familiar, and that she would do anything for Longlegs, including murder or self-harm. After this meeting, Harker goes to a library to further research the Camera family murders, but also to formulate a deeper analysis of Longlegs in order to create a more in-depth profile of him. In another ambiguous bout of psychic powers, or just plain intuition, Harker realizes that the dates on the murders that they do know of formulates an inverted triangle on a calendar that looks a lot like the sigil of Lucifer. Seeing this, Agent Harker realizes that it might help them more accurately predict when Longlegs will murder. We were already clued in early on that the murders took place amongst families where a child had a birthday that fell on the 14th of the month, but not every murder in particular had taken place on the 14th. Now knowing the pattern, the FBI can pinpoint the exact date of any of the killings. When Agent Harker presents this to Agent Carter, he notices that there is a date missing, and reveals that Lee Harker's mother had called the police on said date. Lee has no memory of this, and is implored by Agent Carter to ask her about the incident, thinking it might be related, given the date. At Agent Carter's insistence, Lee visits her mother Ruth, played by Alicia Witt. When we meet Ruth, we see that she is a bit withdrawn and a bit of a hoarder. She has a conversation with Lee about what happened on her 9th birthday, but it ends up devolving into a cryptic and disjointed interaction. However, Ruth seems adamant that nothing happened on Lee's birthday, and then talks about how she has never thrown away any of Lee's possessions, including leaving Lee's bedroom in the same shape as it was as the day she moved out. Another notable aspect of the conversation is Ruth once again asks Lee if she has been saying her prayers. Lee responds that she hasn't, and Ruth replies matter-of-factly that it doesn't matter anyway. Prayers don't do anything. A few key moments from this visit are we find that there's a mysterious door that Lee tries to gain access to, but is unable to find the key. And perhaps more immediately, Lee finds a picture of Longlegs that she had taken when she was a child. In the very beginning of the movie, there's a cold open where Longlegs approaches a young girl, and it is in this moment that we learn that the girl in that scene actually is Lee when she was 9, or almost 9, as Longlegs refers to her as the almost birthday girl. She actually had an instant camera around her neck and took a picture of Longlegs, and it was always in her possession, but she simply just did not ever remember it. Again, I would think that this is yet another ambiguous stroke by the writer of the film. What exactly keeps Lee from remembering? Is it actually supernatural, or is it simply a case of dissociative amnesia brought on by some harrowing trauma? We don't know yet, particularly what Longlegs did when they met, but his demeanor and appearance are so unsettling, we just know it can't be good. Using the picture she has found, she informs Agent Carter to place an all-points bulletin on Longlegs. Given his very distinctive appearance, they feel confident he would be identified. And, well, he is. Actually, very suddenly. They find him waiting on an empty stretch of highway, standing at a bus stop, holding 2 suitcases. Longlegs is swiftly arrested, and we learn his real name is Del Cobble. As Agent Harker interrogates Longlegs/Del, we learn that he is already familiar with Lee Harker. Again, there is some cryptic dialogue. For whatever reason, Osgood Perkins' approach to what makes someone a villain is their inability to directly communicate their ideas. And I will say, without reservation, I did enjoy this movie, but the more I explain it, there are just some things I'm noticing that just don't translate well from a standpoint of trying to summarize this film. I'm not bagging on the director slash writer. It's a well done film and it's very captivating to watch. What makes a film work or not is the totality of the work, the sound, the plot, the photography, lighting, etc. This film works, so, you know, good on Osgood Perkins. Having had enough of his interrogation, Longlegs yells, "Hell's Satan," and proceeds to smash his face against the metal table that he is handcuffed to until he is no longer alive. Harker is too shocked to intervene, and the other FBI agents are just too slow to prevent this from happening because, well, come on, you know. Procedures regarding police custody are not really designed for the safety of the person who's actually in custody, so. After this incident, Harker is informed that Carrie Ann Cameron has also ended her own life by jumping from the roof of the mental hospital. During the interrogation, Longlegs said a few telling things, specifically mentioning his accomplice was a she, and mentions how much he seemed to already know about Lee. This causes Agent Harker to suspect her mother may know more, and she, along with Agent Browning, played by Michelle Choi Lee, go to Ruth's home. And, in a callback to one of the first scenes of the movie, Agent Browning and Agent Harker discuss whether they should approach Ruth as a pair or not. However, unlike Harker's conversation with Agent Fisk in the movie's beginning, it seems Harker is now in the position to make the call, and she chooses to go it alone, leaving Agent Browning in the car. However, it appears that somehow Lee's mother sensed the impending arrest, as she is nowhere to be seen within the home. As Lee Harker explores her childhood home, we are shown that Ruth is now dressed in a nun's habit, holding a shotgun. Sneaking up behind the car that Agent Browning is sitting in, she proceeds to execute her with 2 blasts. Lee witnesses this from within the home, but is unable to do anything to prevent the murder. As Agent Harker makes her way outside to arrest her mother, she sees Ruth standing before a life-size doll of Lee as a young girl, holding a shotgun to its head. She states that Longlegs is now free, and thusly so is Lee, before firing a round at the doll, shattering its head and the brain inside of it. We see black smoke arise from the shattered head, and this causes Lee to collapse. We learn in a flashback that the dolls were made by Del Cobble, aka Longlegs. That, in fact, the doll of Lee was delivered around her 9th birthday. The first shot of the movie is actually shown from the perspective of this doll, riding in the passenger seat of Del's car. Though, we would not know it until this very moment. We learn that Longlegs is a servant of Satan, and the dolls he makes sort of act as a beacon that transmit murderous intent. The reasons for this are not completely clear, but we do know that the dolls have real hair and resemble the child of the families that are targeted, so it's kind of safe to say it falls into certain traditions of black magic, but none that are quite specific. Though it's never quite proven, it seems the dolls need a piece of its subject, hence the real hair and perhaps a possession of the person it is meant to resemble. And yeah, it's quite easy to know where it's going from here. The missing head on the trophy in Ruby's room, for instance, and her parents' inability to part with any of her possessions is not unlike Ruth and Lee's relationship. We know that Ruby is next, and thus Agent Carter and his family are in danger. However, before we get to that, it's important to note that when Lee's doll is, for lack of a better word, killed, Lee falls into an almost comatose state where she is inundated with a rush of memories. Particularly, we learn that Longlegs did in fact attempt to murder Ruth before striking a deal to spare her life and the life of Lee. This Faustian bargain allowed them to live, but it also entrapped Ruth into a lifetime of servitude of Satan. We find out that Ruth has been, for decades, impersonating a nun and delivering dolls to targeted families. In addition, part of her deal is that she would have to witness the murders of the families to ensure the process went as planned. And yeah, the metaphor is pretty clear. Being a parent requires sacrifice. It becomes a life debt of servitude, etc. Well, okay, ideally, that's what being a parent is. I mean, there are definitely some people with kids who are, well, only parents in the most rudimentary sense of the word, who don't really sacrifice anything because, well, they have no actual interest in their children being human beings with their own thoughts and opinions. Anyway, after this, Lee finally awakens from her coma, spell, syncope, I don't know. She's awake, and as she is, we realize that the room that Longlegs has been making his dolls in was actually the basement of Lee's childhood home, and the access to which was the locked door we had seen earlier in the movie. I don't know if it really counts as a twist as much as it's more of a punchline to a joke. Throughout the film, Longlegs mentions being friends with the man downstairs in an obvious reference to Satan, and the idea that Longlegs has been living under Lee's feet throughout her entire childhood I find both equal parts eerie, but also a little comedic. I personally was not terribly thrilled with the reveal. It seemed like an unnecessary contrivance, but I also give my videos stupid titles because, I find that personally amusing, so I'm not going to bash Osgood Perkins for making a joke only he found funny, if that's what it is. And as another aside to this, there's a character named Carrying Camera, and Lee is carrying a camera. I don't know. It seems like a joke. In any case, as Lee awakens, she receives a phone call and a demonic sounding voice reminds her to go to Ruby's birthday party. In his stupor, Lee walks over to the carport on her mother's property, and we find that beneath a car cover that the same car that Longlegs was driving in the opening scene of the movie is being housed there. She manages to find the keys and drives to Agent Carter's home. When Lee arrives at Agent Carter's home, it is clear that something is wrong. Agent Carter and his wife are speaking with a cheery but subtly worried demeanor. We also learn that Ruth Harker is in the home and that Ruby is playing with the life-size doll of herself. It's a very disconcerting scene as no one is behaving naturally at all and there's this palpable tension. Agent Carter makes a lot of reference to cutting cakes and we know that he's already possessed by the doll's spell. Agent Harker, too, appears almost 2 days to intervene when Agent Carter begins murdering his wife in the kitchen. Ruby, completely consumed by the doll, seems unaware anything is even happening. Even when Agent Carter appears from the kitchen, covered in blood, and Agent Harker shoots and kills him, Ruby doesn't react. Lee and her mother have a brief conversation before Lee is forced to defend Ruby with lethal force. In the final moments of the film, Agent Harker grabs Ruby, separates her from the doll, and attempts to shoot it. However, her gun clicks repeatedly, unable to fire. After this, a final sequence is shown of Longlegs speaking during his interrogation, saying, "Hail Satan." And that's it. I really can't do it much justice by explaining the plot. You really just have to see it. Now, with the plot out of the way, well, there are a lot of things to dissect in the film. I didn't want to rehash some of the themes I've seen discussed in other videos, simply because that would be boring to me, and I wouldn't do as well as the channels like Possessed by Horror or Mad Morph that are able to address some of the other stuff with greater competency. That's just not my style. I usually don't want to consume others' media analysis until I'm able to articulate my own thoughts. However, I've only seen this movie once in the theaters, and I wanted to make sure to hit all the plot points in order. So, shout out to those channels. I'm jealous of your following, So, I did want to discuss purpose and obligation. This film seems often like an examination of what it means to be a functioning member of a society, family, or any other organization. Everyone in this movie seems to be motivated by some sort of expectation, rather than any actual desire to work in the capacities to which they find themselves. What I mean by that is that the murders themselves are not the product of any desire within the person committing the act, but neither is the solving of the case. Earlier in the film, Agent Harker mentions to Ruby that she wanted to be an actress, not an FBI agent. This, in fact, mirrors Del Cabo becoming Longlegs in a twisted sense. While it's never explicitly mentioned in the film, I have read that Longlegs' appearance and dress were meant to imply that he was once a glam rocker, albeit an unsuccessful one given his life's trajectory. It's also mentioned that Agent Harker's mother, Ruth, was once a nurse, but obviously she had to quit once she'd made the deal with the devil. Everyone in this film wanted to do something else, and in the end, they just couldn't, which is perhaps the most relatable message in this movie. I don't really know anyone who's doing what they wanted to do. In my friend group, most of us either went to college or the military and chose lines of work that were seemingly reasonable and stable, and yet we're all pretty miserable and unfulfilled. As a personal confession, I wanted to be a musician, and then in my mid-20s, when I seemed to age out of playing live music, I switched to writing manuscripts and short stories, desperately trying to be an author, but this creative outlet, too, was not successful enough to pay the bills or keep me from starving. In a way, we have all taken the same bargain that Lee's mother made with Longlegs. We're all allowed to live so long as we keep doing something that we really don't want to do. Keeping in mind the notion of a coerced existence that most of us all live, it's easy to see how and why the dialogue in the movie seems, at times, stilted and disjointed. It kind of reminded me of this one absurdist comedy called The Art of Self-Defense. It came out in 2019 and it stars Jesse Eisenberg. One of the notable quirks of that film is that all the dialogue is just vocalized subtext. So, rather than communicating with the flourish and affect that we are so often used to in our day to day lives, every line of dialogue lacks any guile or tact. It is just expressions of the purest, most base truth that we so often hide when we speak to each other. However, unlike the art of self defense, the dialogue in Longlegs sometimes reads as theater, as in, none of the characters believe what they are saying. Rather, they're saying the things that people expect of them. It's as if they're playing into the roles that the universe has placed upon them, and the most they can do is witness the lives they've been forced into with a certain level of disappointment and angst. When Longlegs kills himself in the interrogation scene, he does so happily. And if Carrie Ann Cameron is to be believed in the one scene in which we see her, she was also more than happy to end her own life. Living is the struggle. Living means a continued existence conscious of all the things you cannot control, and how they in turn control you. It's why, at the end, when Agent Harker tries to shoot the life-size doll Ruby, she is unable. She wants to do it, but it doesn't matter what she wants. She is still just subject to the whims of this universe, or, in the very worst, she is a pawn of some evil deity. In a way, the horror of the film doesn't come from death at all. In fact, most of the deaths in the film are not the result of some contest or struggle. They either come suddenly or are just almost greeted in a way. The true horror is living a life without any control. Well, that's it. I really wanted to release this a whole lot sooner, but I just couldn't. There's just a lot of things going on, and I do all this stuff for free anyway, so I'm sorry if I'm not doing this semi-regularly as I wanted to, but I received no compensation. So the only way to get me to that road is maybe you like, maybe you subscribe, who knows. Alright, thanks, bye.